They thought he was a gift from the gods, but Rome had crowned its own nightmare. When Caligula stepped into power in 37 AD, the empire welcomed him like a long-lost savior. Flowers rained through the streets, chains shattered in the prisons, and for the first time in years, hope breathed in Rome. But beneath that charming smile and soft voice was a man shaped not by justice, but by performance, where kindness was bait and cruelty was the hook. Caligula didn't rule by law. He ruled by breaking it in the most horrifying ways imaginable. He didn't just destroy lives, he played with them. He would lift a man with honor and shatter him before an audience. He didn't just claim power, he redefined it. Under golden ceilings and among cheering senators, the emperor tested how much Rome would tolerate before breaking. Could the people endure shame packaged as law? Could the nobles survive dignity turned into a joke? With every cruel game, he proved they could. Rome wasn't being ruled, it was being rewritten. This wasn't madness, it was mastery. A performance so terrifying, history tried to forget it. But bones don't forget. And now, neither will you. He was born from blood that ran deep in Rome's veins. His father, Germanicus, was a hero loved by both the army and the people. While other children played with wooden toys, Caligula played among soldiers, dressed in tiny armor. They called him Little Boots, a nickname that made them smile back then. But no one knew that boy would one day make Rome weep. He wasn't taught duty, he was taught how to perform. Every word, every smile, every silence was a part of the stage he would rule from. And when Emperor Tiberius died, the stage was finally his. Rome exploded with joy. After years of fear and cruelty under Tiberius, people believed a new golden age had begun. The prisons were opened. The streets were filled with cheers. Petals covered the roads. It was like the gods themselves had sent Caligula to save them. But the people didn't know they hadn't been saved. They had been seduced. Caligula's kindness was not real. It was bait, a trap designed to measure just how far love could turn into submission. At first, he rewarded those who were loyal. Then he publicly mocked them. He promoted noblemen, gave them titles and honor only to strip them naked in front of their peers, leaving them broken. He didn't need swords to make people kneel. He used shame. He turned respect into humiliation and made obedience into a public performance. He didn't kill right away, he waited. He made people thank him before he ended their lives. He made their final moments part of his show. It didn't take long for the people to notice. Every favor came with a price. Every act of mercy was just another cruel joke. He smiled when people begged, waited just long enough for them to feel hope, then gave the signal to take their lives. What many thought was madness was actually terrifying control. Caligula wasn't out of his mind. He was sharp to sharp. He understood something most emperors forgot. Rome wasn't held together by laws or ideals. It was built on fear, and fear needed to be fed. At first, the Senate laughed off the rumors. Another emperor, another set of wild stories surely exaggerated by jealous rivals. But in Caligula's Rome, rumors weren't lies. They were warnings. The Senate, once the proud voice of Roman law and order, became a house of silence. Men who once debated laws now sat frozen, afraid to speak. Because Caligula wasn't just watching their politics, he was invading their homes. He began calling senators and their wives to the palace, not for discussions, for domination. These meetings often ended in shame, not decisions. He paraded the wives in front of him, treating marriage not as sacred, but as his property. Laws on marriage and morality were turned inside out. The very halls that once protected Roman dignity now echoed with Caligula's jokes about whose wife looked best or obeyed fastest. And when he laughed, everyone else had to laugh too, even if their hearts were breaking. Because to stay silent was dangerous, and not laughing could cost everything. For those who failed to play along, punishment came fast: property taken, titles stripped, families destroyed. Rome's most powerful men, who once shaped the law, now found themselves trapped inside it. Their pride was no longer strength. It was a target. Caligula had figured it out. He didn't need to break the law. He just had to twist it, turn it into something else, something he could use. In one case, he annulled the loyal officer's marriage so he could take the wife for a single night. When the officer protested, Caligula reminded him the emperor's desire was law, not just higher than the law, but the law itself. This wasn't about lust. This was about control, a horrifying blend of personal craving and imperial power. What once made Rome proud, the order, the rules, the structure, was now used to strip them of everything. Behind every public insult, behind every stolen wife, was a chilling logic. Caligula wasn't acting out of madness. He was testing Rome's soul. Could a system built on law survive if the law was turned into a weapon? Could Rome still stand if its laws weren't protecting people, but violating them? So far, the answer was yes. The Senate had once been the heart of Roman power, majestic halls, voices of wisdom echoing against marble walls, men in togas debating justice and law. But under Caligula, that heart began to rot. The Senate wasn't a place of law anymore. It was a stage, a place where every man in the room feared not just for his life, but for his dignity. Words were chosen carefully. Eyes stayed low. Silence became the safest language. Caligula twisted everything. He made the sacred feel cheap. The most personal parts of a man's life, his marriage, his home, his honor, became public playthings. A senator's wife could be summoned without warning. What began as a consultation turned into something darker. Wives would return pale, humiliated, their voices quiet, but no one dared ask questions. Because in Caligula's Rome, asking was dangerous. He didn't just use power. He made sure everyone saw him use it. At banquets, he'd sit hidden behind curtains, listening to conversations. Then he'd suddenly appear, mocking senators about their wives, what they wore, how they behaved, how they sounded. The nobles had no choice but to laugh. Their laughter was hollow, forced, a sound created by fear, not humor. And if someone didn't laugh, that silence could cost him everything. Every rule was reversed. What was once considered shameful was now expected. What used to be praised, honor, loyalty, virtue, was now used as weapons against the men who carried them. In front of their peers, senators were humiliated. Some watched their wives paraded like trophies. Others were made to give up what they held sacred, all while being told they were serving the empire. And all of this was written down. Caligula kept records of every insult, every stolen wife, every moment of submission. He didn't want chaos. He wanted control. And control, to him, meant paperwork. It meant making sure that every act of cruelty was not only carried out, but logged like a business transaction. It wasn't madness, it was accounting. He found a way to turn even the law into a tool of pleasure. A marriage could be undone with a whisper. A family name could be erased with a joke. Caligula would smile, raise a cup, and make a senator thank him for ruining his life. And if the man cried, that was even better. It made the performance richer. Philosopher Seneca, who lived through these years, once wrote that tyranny starts when shame becomes entertainment. And Caligula had mastered that idea. He didn't just want Rome to obey him. He wanted Rome to enjoy it, or at least pretend to. He wanted their fear to wear a smile. The Senate became an audience, not a council. The men who once guided the empire were now actors in Caligula's twisted show. They bowed, they clapped, they agreed with whatever he said. Because disagreeing wasn't brave, it was fatal. But behind the laughter, behind the applause, there was something darker. These acts weren't just about dominance. They were questions. Caligula was testing the very soul of the empire. He wanted to know, how far could he go? How much could Rome take before it snapped? With every public disgrace, every broken vow, he was asking Rome a terrible question. You still believe in your own laws? Now that I've twisted them, will you still follow me if I take everything from you? So far, the answer was always yes, because no one wanted to be the first to say no. And that, Caligula knew, was true power. Caligula's rule had crossed a point of no return. What had started as strange behavior turned into a full system built on fear and humiliation. He wasn't hiding his cruelty anymore, he was putting it on display. And Rome kept watching, too afraid to look away. The Senate still met, still passed laws, still bowed their heads and spoke of duty. But beneath the surface, everyone knew the truth. The real government was happening behind the palace doors. By now, the emperor didn't just want control of people's actions. He wanted their thoughts, their emotions, their silence. Each day, senators woke up not knowing if it would be the day they lost everything. Because Caligula had learned the most dangerous trick of all. He turned obedience into proof of loyalty and pain into currency. Behind the walls of his palace, the most respected women in Rome, senators' wives, noble daughters, even priestesses, were summoned. Not as guests, as offerings. There were no private lives anymore. Caligula had claimed the right to take whatever he wanted from anyone, and he made sure everyone understood that this was now law. Refusal wasn't just risky, it was rebellion, treason. He even mocked the laws while using them. Legal meetings were interrupted by personal insults. Religious rules were twisted to fit his own desires. And the strange thing, it worked. Rome was still standing. The temples were still filled. The taxes were still collected, because no one dared say otherwise. Caligula's cruelty wasn't wild. It was carefully organized. His officials wrote down every act, every stolen name, every forced union. Women were recorded like assets transferred from one home to the next under the emperor's will. One day, a senator's wife. The next day, his personal prize. And then returned. With her status changed, her dignity erased. And the worst part, it wasn't just lust, it was strategy. Caligula understood that humiliation was more powerful than violence. A man could recover from wounds, but being broken in front of your peers, that stayed forever. The emperor declared himself a living god, Jupiter reborn. And if he was Jupiter, then every marriage, every sacred union, every moral law was under his command. He claimed divine right not just over people's lives, but their souls, if Jupiter had many lovers. So, would he? And no one could stop him. Because his orders were wrapped in the language of law and religion, he didn't need to swing a sword. His words were enough. His whispers could erase a vow, destroy a family, or turn a respected woman into a symbol of submission. Even the priests stayed quiet, knowing that the next ritual might come with a hidden demand. The city was no longer shocked. It was numb. Every time a new story came out, a new wife taken, a new rule mocked, it was just another reminder of how fragile everything had become. Power, law, honor, they all bent the moment desire entered the room. But Caligula wasn't just breaking rules. He was experimenting. He wanted to see how far Rome could be pushed. Could a society built on pride survive complete disgrace? Could law still matter when it was used to justify shame? He asked these questions not with speeches but with actions. And each time, Rome answered the same way: silence. The temples remained open. The Senate still met. The city carried on, because as long as people obeyed, the system survived. Caligula had discovered something chilling: domination didn't need blood. It just needed fear and humiliation, carefully measured and repeated until people forgot what dignity felt like. By the second year of his rule, there was no longer any real difference between Caligula's personal life and the Roman state. The palace was no longer a seat of government, it had become something darker, something unrecognizable. It was now a marketplace where people were traded, used, and discarded. Senators didn't just lose their voices, they lost their pride, their families, their place in society. Some didn't even know how it happened. They walked into the palace with honor and left broken, with nothing but silence in their mouths. Wives and daughters were no longer protected by name or blood. Caligula saw bodies not as people but as currency. And what gold could not buy, fear could. What power couldn't demand, humiliation could force. He didn't hide any of it. That was the point. It wasn't a secret brothel, it was public policy. This wasn't about pleasure. It was about proof. Proof that nothing in Rome, not even virtue, could stand against him. The very halls where emperors once held councils were now rooms filled with perfumes and whispers, no longer used for debate, but for submission. The air inside smelled not of incense or politics, but of shame. And no one was safe. Invitations from the palace weren't honors. They were warnings. If you were summoned, you went. If your wife was summoned, she went. If you resisted, you vanished. The wives of Rome's elite were forced to serve guests as if they were temple servants. Priestesses, once protected by their sacred vows, were ordered to entertain under the name of divine service. The gods themselves were pulled into the performance. And no one could refuse, because to say no was to betray the emperor, and betrayal meant death. What made it even more terrifying was how organized it all was. This wasn't chaos, it was a system. Guests paid coins to enter these rooms, real money, handed over like they were buying wine or bread. But what they were buying was submission. The money went to the empire's treasury. Caligula's scribes took notes, marked names, counted coins. Every act of degradation became a line in a ledger. The treasury, once drained by his endless games and statues, was refilled through shame. It wasn't just cruelty, it was efficiency. He had found a new way to fund the empire. A darker kind of tax, a tax paid with bodies and pride. Rome had never imagined such a system could exist. But now it did for Caligula. This was power in its purest form. He had erased the line between what was public and what was private. There was no home anymore. No safe place, no boundary. And once every virtue had a price, there was nothing left to fight with. He wanted them to feel it, to know it, to live it. Every man who entered the palace left a little smaller. Every woman who served knew she was no longer her own. And the emperor made sure they remembered it. Some nights, senators were forced to watch, to see their wives serve strangers, to hear the sounds, and through it all, Caligula would laugh, tossing coins as if he were blessing them. When one nobleman cried, openly and without shame, Caligula looked him in the eye and said, "Why weep, Senator? You should be proud. Your household now serves Rome." This wasn't sex. It wasn't desire. It was control. The brothel was now part of the government. The bed, his throne. The humiliation was no accident, it was the message. He even minted tokens. Small bronze, pieces with his face on one side and the word divine on the other. They were used for entry into his palace of shame. Archaeologists would later find these near the old imperial grounds, proof that this horror wasn't a rumor, it was real. Caligula didn't always take part directly. Sometimes he watched from the shadows, hooded, silent, observing how far people would go to please him, how much they would suffer to survive. Senators bowed not in meetings but at doorways. They whispered prayers not to the gods, but to the emperor himself. And he smiled, because everything he had built was working. Even with all the madness, all the cruelty, the machine of Rome kept turning. That was what Caligula had discovered. Humiliation didn't stop the empire. It fueled it. The treasury was full again, not from trade or conquest, but from shame. The empire's most sacred values had been turned into commodities. A noble woman's honor, once worth more than gold, now had a price. A priestess's vow, once binding for life, could now be broken with a nod from the emperor. But Caligula wasn't finished. He hadn't just turned sex into politics, he had made humiliation into law. Each night of forced service wasn't hidden. It was recorded. It was structured. His scribes kept records like accountants. Who entered, who paid, who served. Rome's dignity was being tracked on scrolls, and the ledgers were growing fat. He had taken control of Rome's laws, its temples, its bodies. Now he wanted its soul. He began declaring sacred marriages invalid, claiming that as the living Jupiter, he alone could approve or dissolve any union. Couples who had been married for decades suddenly found their bonds erased with a single decree. Wives were removed from their homes. Daughters disappeared into the palace. No protest mattered, because Caligula didn't argue, he commanded. His decrees came wrapped in divine authority. On paper, they were laws. In reality, they were letters of doom. Families opened sealed messages expecting honors, only to find their daughter summoned, their wife reassigned, their status revoked. And once it was written, there was no reversal. To question him was to question the gods. He made people live in fear not just of violence, but of paperwork. Men who once laughed at rumors now wept in silence. Those who had defended him in the Senate began to realize their loyalty had bought them nothing but exposure. Their families were now targets. Their names were jokes whispered behind palace curtains. And still, no one fought back, because Caligula had rewired the entire system. Dignity was dangerous. Silence was safety. The only way to survive was to submit, and even that wasn't a guarantee. One day he might spare you. The next, he might break you just to see how loud you scream. Even the priest bowed lower now, not to their gods, but to the man who claimed to be one. Caligula began rewriting sacred text, inserting himself into the myths, making himself part of the rituals. Incense was burned in his name. Sacrifices were offered not to Jupiter, but to the emperor who claimed to be his flesh. And as always, he watched how Rome reacted, watched how deep the silence went. Every nod from a senator, every forced smile from a nobleman, every choked-back tear from a mother, he saw it all. And each time, he nodded to himself. The empire was his, not just in law, but in spirit. Rome had become something else. The marble still shined, the statues still stood, but everything inside was different now. The city still moved, but it moved like a body with no soul, a corpse acting out the memory of life. This was Caligula's true talent. He didn't destroy the empire. He infected it, from the inside out, and no one knew how to stop it. The most terrifying part wasn't what Caligula did, it was how normal it started to feel. At first, people whispered. Then, they went quiet. After a while, even the silence faded into habit. The city adjusted. The Senate still met. Markets still opened. People still prayed in temples. Even though they knew the gods they prayed to now shared space with a man who had defiled everything sacred. Senators no longer asked if their wives would be taken, they waited for it. They dressed their daughters in their finest robes, hoping that if they looked respectful enough, they might be spared. Others, desperate to protect their status, offered them willingly. Loyalty had turned into surrender. Rome was not being ruled, it was being undone, one family at a time. Inside the palace, what once might have shocked the empire now passed without comment. Women were brought in at night, some already trembling, some too numb to react. The guards didn't blink. The scribes continued their notes. Bronze tokens clinked as men entered like customers, dropping coins to buy what used to be holy. And Caligula, he walked those halls like a god surveying his temple. He liked to disguise himself, covering his face with a hood, moving quietly through the palace corridors. He watched everything. How senators begged, how wives tried to hold back tears, how Rome's finest men kissed his feet with their eyes. It wasn't just a game. It was proof. Proof that shame could break a person faster than any sword. that once someone gave up their pride, the rest of them followed easily. There were no more masks in Rome. Everyone's face told the same story: fear. Even the nobles, once proud and powerful, now looked like shadows of themselves. They no longer argued laws. They repeated Caligula's words like prayers. He had taken their language and made it hollow. He didn't have to threaten them anymore. They threatened themselves with every breath. The coins with his face became a symbol of this sickness. What had once been a currency of trade had become a tool of obedience. You couldn't move through the city without seeing him on walls, on tokens, on altars. The face of a man who took everything, smiling like a god who believed he'd done them a favor. It wasn't just about ruling anymore. Caligula wanted to see if power could survive when it stopped pretending. When the emperor didn't even hide his cruelty. When the whole city was forced to accept it as normal, could Rome still live? And the answer was yes. That was the horror. He had proven that a city as proud as Rome, a system as complex as the empire, could be bent to one man's desire. Not through war, not through speeches, but through humiliation so deep it poisoned every part of life. There was no need for armies in the streets. The people policed themselves. They learned to smile while breaking. They learned to kneel before they were pushed. And Caligula, walking those quiet palace halls, knew it. He had taken the empire's pride and turned it into his playground. And the scariest part was, it worked out by now. The palace no longer felt like a place of government. It was a machine that turned power into fear, fear into silence, and silence into control. There were no more laws in Rome, only decisions. And every decision came from Caligula's lips. The Senate had become hollow. Meetings were held, speeches were made, budgets reviewed. But everyone knew those words meant nothing. Whatever Caligula wanted, he got. If he decided a senator's home should be taken, it was taken. If he wanted a noble's daughter sent to the palace, she was sent. And the men who signed those orders, they were the same men whose families had been broken the night before. They kept the machine running, not because they believed in it, but because they were too afraid to stop it. Each new command from the emperor felt more surreal, more shameless, yet it was always obeyed. A priestess was removed from her temple and sent to serve in the palace. When questioned, Caligula declared that the gods themselves had spoken through him. And no one argued. They just lowered their eyes and nodded. These weren't isolated events. This was Rome now. Every home had a shadow over it. Fathers no longer protected their daughters. Husbands no longer defended their wives. People weren't just afraid to speak, they were afraid to think. Even their thoughts, they believed, might betray them. Every part of Roman identity had been touched by Caligula's hand. The law was no longer justice. It was his pleasure. The temples were no longer sacred. They were part of his theater. The Senate was no longer leadership. It was a crowd forced to clap on command. And through it all, Caligula watched with satisfaction. He had found a way to make the empire serve him without a single uprising. No revolts, no public outcry. Because he knew something most rulers didn't: when you take away a person's pride, they'll obey you forever. Rome's pride had died long ago, but the body kept moving. There was no one left to resist. The people who might have stood against him had already fallen. Some had taken their own lives. Others disappeared. Most simply faded into quiet roles, doing what they were told and pretending not to see what was happening around them. Even the gods were quiet now. Statues of Jupiter stood next to coins bearing Caligula's smirking face. Sacrifices were made not to the heavens, but to the man who claimed he ruled them. It was no longer blasphemy, it was routine. And the city, once the pride of the world, had become something else. A place that looked beautiful on the outside, but was hollow inside. The marbles still gleamed, the fountains still flowed. But the people had changed. They walked with lowered heads and guarded hearts. They whispered, if they whispered at all. Caligula had won, not just with force but with strategy. He had proven a terrible truth. An empire doesn't need violence to fall. Sometimes, all it takes is one man with enough cruelty, enough charm, and enough control to make obedience feel easier than resistance. And Rome, the city that once ruled the world, now belonged to him completely. By the end, there was nothing left to hide. The palace, the Senate, even the temples, all of it had become part of Caligula's stage. He had turned the empire into a reflection of himself, hollow, cruel, and obsessed with control. Rome still wore its crown, still spoke of law and glory, but everyone knew it was just for show. No one believed in the system anymore. Not the senators who voted with shaking hands. Not the priests who offered prayers they no longer meant. Not the people who lined the streets in silence. Caligula had stripped Rome of its soul and filled the emptiness with his desires. His rule didn't collapse with war or rebellion. It ended with a whisper, a quiet conspiracy, a few blades in a hallway. Even then, he didn't beg. He laughed, because he knew he had already won. He had shown Rome the truth, that power isn't just about ruling bodies. It's about breaking spirits. And when he fell, the empire tried to bury his memory. But the scars he left on law, on faith, on dignity never fully healed. Rome survived him. But it never recovered.